When I began this book a mere 10 years ago, I found quickly that the Bible did give freedom from slavery after 7 years. I had no idea I would take it that personally, but this is quite what happened. When I began writing the book, my daughter, who was very little, used to tell people that her father was an author. As the years went on, she told people that her father wrote a book. The father is very happy because on last Saturday, he sent the manuscript off to New York. The first draft was a mere 470,000 words. That was a few years ago. It's now down to 150. It was important that I send it off because if I waited another 3 years, by extrapolation, it would be the null set. There would be sort of like England in Eurovision. Anyways, what did I learn about it? One thing I learned is that publishers do not have a great sense of humor. They said, "What title do you want?" I said, "Let's call it the 10 Commandments." They waited. I said, "We mean the subtitle." I said, "How about take 2 tablets and phone me in 3,000 years?" They waited again. They didn't think that was a very good idea. I needed Rory, but he was not there to help. I learned many things while writing this book about the 10 Commandments. One is never, ever write a book about the 10 Commandments. The other thing is that there's many things that people that we think we know. Oh, the other thing is all the jokes about it in the cartoons. I've heard those, guys, honestly. But I'm happy to get a few more later. Anyways, I learned several things. We have an assumption that Moses came down from Mount Sinai, the guy with the big beard and the tablets and the 10 Commandments, and they were joined like this and stuff. Well, it turned out it was all wrong. It wasn't like that. It's extremely unlikely that if Moses existed, he had a beard. Turned out in the Bible, Moses is described as having like a Hebrew name. But what the people who wrote the Bible didn't realize, the Bible was written much later than the events described, is that the word Moses is an Egyptian name. You think of Tutmoses or Ramses. Tutmoses is the son of Tut. Ramses is the son of Ra, the Egyptian god. So Moses was just means son of or born by. And so the people had no idea. It'd be like, suppose there's some people in New York City who had a folk myth that they came from Mexico long, long before. And you didn't believe them because there's no evidence. And they said, well, I mean, it's true, our founders had good American names like Pablo and Juanita and stuff, but they're clearly not Mexican names. You think, well, maybe they did come from Mexico at some point. You're carrying that along. So Egyptians didn't have beards. So if there was a Moses, and he did come from Egypt, he would not have a beard. But that wasn't the biggest thing I found. The biggest thing I found was really quite small. Tablets at that time, you can see some of them if you go to the British Museum, were really tiny because the people who made tablets would put them in one hand, soft clay, and they would inscribe on them. So if the 10 Commandments did exist, they were about this big, right? These cute little things. And in the British Museum, I think in room 43, you can see examples of cute little tablets. So there wasn't a guy with a beard, and they weren't big tablets. The other thing is, that image of the double tablets, with Mel Brooks comes down and says, "Oh yeah, I dropped one," stuff. That image of the double tablets was first cited in Italy in the 1200s. And it was based on the way that people had wrote on a wax. They had 2 tablets of wax that'd be joined together in a little top because their hinges were quite poor. They didn't have the British kite mark benefits. And the booklets would be like this, and it'd be a little curve on top. So they copied it from that. So that was at least 2,000 years after the original 10 Commandments, and there's no description in the Old Testament or New Testament of them ever being curved. Okay, so there wasn't a guy with a beard. There weren't big tablets. There weren't double tablets. Turns out there weren't even 10 Commandments. If you yes, some of you, I know, keep your Bibles hidden underneath. And by the way, I have to say, in researching this book, when I read the Old Testament and the New Testament and the Quran on successive days of the week, I met a lot of interesting people on the tube. I mean, a lot of interesting people. And occasionally, I would go over to people and I'd be holding my books, and they'd say, "That's okay, man, you can sit there, but let's not talk. I don't want to talk." Well, it turns out in Exodus 34, which I know you're just going to pop open to right now, it's called the Dodecalogue, and 12 commandments are listed. So some people parse it differently and make it for 8. So it turns out the commandments were, again, all this was written down long after the historical events are being talked about, and there's stories that vary. The story of the Red Sea crossing, for example, there's 4 different versions that you could trace out. And in one of them, there's a little mud flat, a lagoon, where some chariots gets their wheels stuck in mud. In another, walls of water separate. And you can actually date these different stories and see how they go in. In the late 1930s, there was a giant hurricane outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and people got really excited. And a few weeks later, people were bored. And a guy used to walk around Boston Common with a sign saying, "For 25 cents, I will listen to your hurricane story," Anyways, so there wasn't the beard. There weren't the big tablets. There weren't the double tablets. There weren't the 10 commandments always. And guess what? There weren't even any commandments. It turns out the word commandment is a nice Hebrew word, but that's not the one used in the Old Testament for this. The word that's used is, brace yourself, guys, word, or possibly utterance, debarim. So they were just the 10 words. They're just statements. They're sort of like little infinitives. And they describe the sort of ideal world, a world where, not a world necessarily of the smiting and tearing out the entrails. That's elsewhere, especially in the book of Joshua, but a world where old people are respected and you tend not to have too much scurrilous gossip around you in public, things like that. Anyways, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how they worked, and then and a little bit about what they can do for us. Because I know a lot about how they work and very little about what they can do for us, I'm going to concentrate on the first part, and what they can do for us, my good old colleague Rory will answer when we're sitting on the panel later. So I'll give little hints about it, okay? So it turns out by dating the commandments, which again is deeply exciting, you can find out a lot about how they work. Gosh, the commandments look very much like treaties from the ancient world. Now, are they just like the Assyrian treaties of 700 BC? This is a big debate in academic circles. And it turns out they're not. The Assyrian treaties of 700 BC, they say things like, "You will do as I, the Assyrian king, say, otherwise thy skin shall be flayed from thy body, and thy children shall be attacked," and blah, 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 blah. The Assyrian treaties just come in with these harsh demands and no preliminaries. There's no flowers, there's no courtship, there's nothing. There's an invasion and death. Turns out, before that, there was a type of treaty that had been popular for several hundred years that stopped abruptly in 1200 BC. And those were treaties from a different empire, the Empire of the Hittites, based in what's now central Turkey. And those treaties began much more gently. They were like what you should do on e-harmony and stuff. So first they say, there's a major clause saying, they were a treaty between a king and a junior king. I've come, I've helped your people. In response, maybe you'll do these things like give me grain shipments and stuff like that. They talk gently and they explain why it's going on. They have these motive clauses at the beginning. Well, the 10 Commandments follow that step by step. There's the initial statement, I am the Lord thy God who delivered you from slavery and stuff. Oh, that's nice. Well, I feel an obligation back. So there was called a covenant rather than a treaty. A treaty is sort of like if you ever work for a large organization and your boss has really ticked you off. So you say, okay, or certain marriages have been like that. Okay, fine. You want to be like that? I'll work to rule. Fine. And that's like a treaty. There's these exact rules that's imposed. They don't come from the heart. A covenant is like a good relationship, or when the mood's going well, there's a mutual choice. The interesting thing is those treaties from the Hittites stopped cold in 1200 BC. And that's a little hint of what happened when the 10 Commandments, if there was anything historical to them, began. Because people a few hundred years later wouldn't think of something that came from the distant past unless there was some reason for it. And it turns out in 1200 BC, an amazing thing happened. All the civilizations around the Eastern Mediterranean collapsed. The famous Dark Ages in Greece began. The Mycenaean culture failed. There have been studies, there's a lot of arrowheads and bone skeletons in the city of Troy in the west of Anatolia, because this is when the Trojan War seemed to have taken place. And there was just chaos, and for several hundred years, very little happened. The big empires fell. It was the end of the Bronze Age, and very slowly the beginning of the Iron Age. The reason it was the end of the Bronze Age is to make bronze, you need copper, which is easy to find, and tin, which isn't. It has to be imported. People couldn't have the imports things going, so they had to use some local stuff, which was iron, of which there's a lot more. Anyways, at that time, populations went down terrifically. In Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, they went down like 75 or 80%. It was real chaos. Imagine our just-in-time systems really failed. But there were a few places where people went for refuge up in the hills. And the hills west of the River Jordan, a very peaceful place at that time, went from having about 20 villages to suddenly having about 400. So people were moving there, but there's no signs of palaces, there's no signs of courts, there's no signs of police or archives or something. And so somehow they were sort of organizing themselves, must have been some sort of abstract principles. Very confusing. Anyways, so what's an example of like a covenant rather than a treaty, which people want to, it gives you authority, because you won't, a parent will say, do this because I tell you so. So why would people follow these treaties? They had a sort of, these covenants, they had a sort of a buy-in. Wow, you had just survived the Boston hurricane, or your family had made it out of slavery, or other people had gone from like destroyed cities elsewhere that were being destroyed. And we know that in advertising, from my little bit of knowledge as a pathetically misguided consumer, sometimes you see a world and you think, I want to be in that world. Remember Mae West's famous line, why do men like women with a reputation? Because they hope that history will repeat itself, right? So when I see one of those beautiful black and white ads for like Nike athletes and stuff, they don't look impossibly muscled. They sort of look like me if I had 11 years to focus on this and eat better and stuff. I want to be part of that world. It's an impetus that I want to be a part of. Well, the second thing the commandments do is that it turns out their statements, they don't say, thou must eviscerate the Canaanites. That's elsewhere in the Old Testament. But they aim for a sweet spot. They pick an area of behavior which is neither at one extreme nor the other and is something plausible. The adultery commandment is like that. The adultery commandment, commandment 7 by the standard counting, doesn't say thou must never have sex. If that happened, the internet, of course, would collapse. It's being supported by the hormones of teenage boys and one or two others. It doesn't say never have sex, but nor does it say one can just like randomly have any relationships. Basically, a married woman isn't allowed to have extramarital relationships. Now, if you think about it, it's a stretch for humans, but it's not an implausible stretch. And we can actually prove this by looking at something that I'm sure many of you were thinking of this morning, primate testicles, especially that of the gorilla. It turns out, if you've ever studied these things, gorillas have really, really, really small things. And the reason is they have guaranteed harems, because the males are absolutely huge compared to the females, and they control the harems, and there's no competition among sperm. When a female gorilla has only one male mate, and that's it. Chimpanzees, however, have enormous testicles. It's humiliating, it's embarrassing, it's really a warm day. Even in cold rooms, they don't shrink. They're huge, because when a female chimpanzee goes in heat, she'll have relations with 6, 7, or 8 male chimpanzees that afternoon. Sometimes if one is lining up and is taking his time, she'll sort of like tilt elsewhere and have a few more. So the competition has to be by sperm cells, right? So for that, they need enormous testicles. The ones that don't have it. So in an extremely promiscuous sort of primate group, it's not an exact proof for us, but it's an interesting analogy. In an extremely promiscuous group, the males will have large testicles, and in a highly monogamous or faithful group, the males can get by with much smaller ones. So the question is, proportional to size, did you expect this in Kent? Where is the male testicle? I've had a long career coming here. I never thought that I would address an audience with that momentous phrase. Well, it turns out we men are exactly halfway in between, except possibly for Daniel Radcliffe when he was in New York City doing Equus. He said what terrified him wasn't acting in public. What terrified him was what was going to be the ambient temperature when he did the deed in Equus. Well, it turns out males are in between humans. And the size of the primate testicle, at least to the extent that these analogies hold up, is a readout of female sexuality. Isn't that neat? So like if the women were highly promiscuous, if you can use that phrase, then the men will have had to have large testicles. If the women weren't, small. Humans are right in between. Isn't that curious? So suggesting that the commandment about adultery, it's a stretch, but it's not an impossible stretch. And think of a sort of like a businessman from the Midlands who's in London looking for a little bit of action. He's tempted by that, but he also feels a little bit guilty. Also, they tell him that the thing with the paisleys, the velvet lapels, it's not a good idea. It's not going to work. So he can go home a little bit disappointed, and life's okay. Well, it turns out almost all the commandments identify very cleverly this really good sweet spot. Oh, we're okay for timing. The sweet spot in between. So one of the commandments, it doesn't say don't gossip, the 9th commandment. It says don't tell significant lies in public places, which is entirely different. Clearly you're going to gossip. If somebody gave you a commandment, never gossip at office, that's no good. But if they say, if it's a legal proceeding, don't tell an untruth, you can do that. It's a stretch, but it's not a stretch too far. It's sort of like it's not Arnhem, it's like you're well before Arnhem. Or the one about parents, the commandment about parents, the 5th one, doesn't say thou must love thy parents. That isn't always possible. However, it says honor, which is very different. Honor you can do. Curious. The commandment about coveting, it doesn't say thou can never look enviously upon thy neighbor's objects. It just says, the word it's a particular Hebrew word, and basically it says don't obsess about it. Don't keep on thinking about something so that you go from the realm of thought to action. Clearly you can have these thoughts, but it doesn't have to be zero-sum. You don't have to get things by bringing it down. That's why we like working in companies that are expanding very well, because there's opportunities for everybody. We don't like working in companies where, my gain is your loss, and we're in for it. In the U.S. Army, going back to the 1940s, there was an assessment system which was 360-degree assessment. Everybody would comment on the people around them, and promotions were up for it. It was commonly known as FYB, something your buddies. So that's what you would do. Okay, so we could talk about how to intervene at those sweet spots. Another thing the commandments do, if you want to reverse what they say don't do this and don't do that. Well, the thing that they say don't do, clearly we're tempted by it. So one of them is, thou shalt not, murder and kill all the time. Well, Grand Theft Auto realizes, yes, people like to murder and kill. And the other one is like the one that says, don't lie in public places about charges against the other people. Yeah, so we like gossiping and stuff. Or the second commandment about idolatry, which, by the way, if you haven't recently read it, they're against it. Idolatry, they're against it. Well, clearly, all this signing up of Olympic stars works really, really well. The logic fails. It's unclear whether the man who did that wonderful thing on the horse in the London Olympics got the magnificent physique by eating McDonald's as much as one might think. But if it seems so, if I associate with it, I can idolize towards it. So these, basically what they tell us not to do, it's like lying back and doing snow angels, the reverse of the outline, like solarized photographs, can give us a little hint of, oh yeah, that is an accessible point. That's another weak point we can get into. 2 more pages. The next thing they do is that they work at a really good level of abstraction. They don't say like, be nice, which is like, doesn't really helpful, nor do they go into extreme detail about what to do. They're just at this intermediate level, and that's very useful. Human beings respond to that. Now, we have to do it well. Aristotle was famous for saying, he was famous for many things. One of the things he did was say that women have fewer teeth than men. If he had asked Mrs. Aristotle to open and count, he would have found that wasn't the case. But he did make an excellent point about maxims. He said, people in the countryside love maxims because they give you the impression of high intelligence and they're worthless. Out of sight, out of mind is balanced very much by distant loves grow fonder. You can find a maxim for every occasion, but it seems beautifully abstract and wise. So it's sort of like a mathematical model by the sort of economists who we found that we didn't like earlier today. So the sort of the useful principles, the right level of abstraction, it's not going to be dull maxims. People usually won't fall for that. But it won't be extremely detailed stuff. And good slogans, things that are picked up on and we respond to, it's a sort of level of abstraction that we respond to. It's hard to say in words. It'll come up more in the discussion. But there's like guidance that we like, the sort of ads where they have like usually a sports commentator with a deep, gravelly voice explaining that with this sort of beer, you have a really satisfying life and good thing with your mates. It isn't like a general be happy, but it isn't a detailed account of biochemistry. It's a sort of intermediate level that we like. Okay, and the final thing, of course, is that commandments are always flexibly interpreted. They changed a lot over time. I mentioned the adultery commandment. It's the one chapter when I ask people, would you like to read one chapter, that they never ask for, right? Which by the reverse image means that's the one they're really interested in. Well, it turns out, although the original commandment just said married women have to be careful in an area before contraception, St. Augustine, in around 400 in North Africa, interpreted it differently. He said adultery, possibly he knew my ex-wife, he said adultery is if you have sexual relationships and you enjoy it. If you enjoy it, you have to stop instantly at that moment because then you're committing adultery. It's only okay to continue if you're not enjoying it. Otherwise, you have to instantly stop. I apologize for that last comment. Anyways, for like 1,000 years, this was really important with the monastic and other movement in England, and led, of course, to centuries of guilt. Thing is, you can push these commandments too far. Some people are happy with that world, and of course, in medieval times when women would be treated very badly, it can be a nice ideal. Women could be in an isolated place; they could finally be free of constant pregnancy and stuff. So there could be some advantages to it, but it's too far of a push from human behavior. There's going to be a pullback. I will now recap. So they weren't commandments. There weren't 10. Moses didn't have the beard. All sorts of stuff like that. They came from an era of chaos when people wanted security and stuff, which clearly, with our consumer choice, we want a similar thing. They weren't forced on people. There was a sort of buy-in. They were a covenant more than a treaty and stuff. They identified this vulnerable sweet spot in human behavior. They noticed that they also realized that we do have a reflex to be bad, and we can resonate very much with those things. They were pitched at just the right useful level, not vapidly abstract, not detailed, too particular, and also they changed over time. So to use them, you have to be adaptable, which is a good principle for all of us. Thank you.